Okay. Roy, do you want to tell us about this photograph?
Well, it's my parents' wedding picture. Of course, it was a while before I was around. I think they got married in 1916. And of course, they were farmers and they lived on different farms. Before my time, but they told about different farms they had lived on. And then in 1928, they built up a farm of their own, bought some rocky land in the hills west of Maricourt. And so they were, when the 30s hit, they had just built that new farm up and had borrowed everything they could to get the thing going. And money was so easy to borrow in the 20s. But like now, these guys walk out of the bank with $100,000 loan. Well, they didn't walk in with 100,000, but they walked out probably with $1,000 loan, and it took a long time to pay for it after things would come apart in the 1930s. So, I mean, life wasn't easy for them, and I thought they were old when they died, but I'm 8 years older than either one of them got when they died. My dad died at 72, and my mother died at the age of 73, I think.
Do you know how they met each other?
How they met?
Yeah.
Well, like I said, my father had come to this country single, and by then they were already putting thrashing crews together, and my mother's family owned a thrashing rig, and he worked there as a laborer. That's how they met. When he come to this country, he was all alone, but he did have, I think, 3 uncles that were living here already. So he had a little connection. But I remember him telling when he was going to leave over there, well, he was the only one in his family that was old enough to get drafted in the Russian army. He was the oldest one. The rest of them were younger. And his father wasn't interested in leaving, and he just told him, well, if you want to go, that's up to you. And I think he said he gave him 5 rubles, which is equivalent to $5. But he had some friends that made arrangements for him to come aboard ship with them, and when they got here, then he'd work as a hired man for them until he paid off that fee for getting across to the, whatever you call it, ticket, a ticket for coming to America on a ship. And so he wasn't around. The uncles were living in the Culm area. So that's how he got to the Culm area.
How old was he when he came over?
18.
Did he ever talk about what life was like in Russia?
Yes, a good deal. I mean, he'd have been ready to go back. I mean, he said they just didn't have this cold weather we got and all these things. Well, I mean, he had lived as a young man. He had lived a pretty easy life, I think. I mean, what it seemed like. Sure, they had to work, but he he didn't have any real hardships living it there. I mean, but things changed, and he took off for himself. Now I don't know. I suppose they really didn't know what the odds were against them to come across the country like that. And most of them, even if they'd wanted to go back, they didn't have the means to go back.
Did he ever talk about what that voyage was like on the ship?
Yes, I mean, he was, because they had to get by as cheap as they can, and they called it steerage, living down in the bottom part of the ship. And those days, in that bottom part of the ship, they also had animals for slaughter on the way. So he pretty well had a camp down. And these friends that had sponsored him to come over here were financially a little better off. So they'd sneak him up there, and then he could eat a meal with them every once in a while. But I don't ever remember him saying how many days they were out on the ocean. I imagine in those days it probably was five days for sure. I mean, they weren't sailing ships anymore, but I know I've heard some of these old timers years ago talk about it, and they actually came across on sailing ships. But they had, steam powered ships by now. But especially when my dad come, because he come over here in 1912.
How about your mom? How old was she when she came over?
6.
Okay. Did she remember life in Russia at all?
Not much. I mean, she didn't remember much from Russia at all. I mean, she was a 6-year-old.
Did your mom's family settle in the Column area and your dad's?
Well,
Or your dad?
my mother's family is homesteaded about 6 miles southeast of here, and the farm is still in the family, in the Herman family. And there's a young third generation, like a second cousin to me, is living on that farm now, and they had some rough time because they built a sod shack when they come here. You hear of sod shanties, they lived in one. Now I have never seen a sod shanty like, I've seen them at some of these homes like Lawrence Welks and someplace, but but they lived in a sod shanty when they came over for a number of years. And there was already the parents and my mother and her older sister and her younger sister. So there were 5 of them in a one room. I don't imagine things were too good, but they survived.
And what is your dad's name?
Christian,
Christian. And what's your mom's name?
Mary. Her
Mary.
maiden name was Mary Herman.
Mary Herman. Okay. Do you know about how old they were when they got married?
They weren't real, I'd say about 22.
Okay, probably about 22. Do you know how long they were married before he passed away?
They never made it to 50 years. So Dad died in 1964, and Ma died a year and a half later, so it was 65 somewhere in there. No, they never lived to. Dorothy's parents didn't either live to celebrate a 50th anniversary. Nowadays, man, there's guys, number of guys here in town that celebrate their 60th anniversary. We had ours 3 years ago, our 50th anniversary 3 years ago, and I wasn't young when I got married. I mean, I was 27. So.
Where did they get married? Do you know? Did they get?
I would think in this Beresina church that I'm quite sure that the church was built already. I know they talked about when they first, their faith was very important to them. When they first came and they had a church in different homes. And then for a while, I remember my mother talking that they held church services when the schoolhouse was built out there. So, and that schoolhouse is still setting over in Grand Rapids Memorial Park. They moved it over there a couple of years ago and made a museum out of it, about old schools, the desks and the whole thing.
So what denomination were they?
Well, they became Congregationalists when they came to America. When they were in Russia, they were Lutherans. Because that's what 90%, if they weren't Lutherans, they were Catholics in Russia, I think.
Do you know why they changed to Congregationalists?
Well, some, no doubt, preacher came around and, there were a lot of things going on that they didn't like in that Lutheran church. The preacher said everything. The congregation didn't have much to say what was going to happen. And of course, Congregationalism from way back when the Pilgrims were Congregationalists, I mean, the body, the congregation made the rules and hired the preacher, and he didn't tell them how to run the show. So mainly because of that.
So are you still Congregationalist today?
To a degree, yes. I mean, a couple of years ago, the Congregational Church merged and became the United Church of Christ. They merged with the Reformed Church, and a couple others got together. And them people got so liberal that anybody that had any Bible knowledge couldn't live with them anymore. So we separated away, but we still got a church here in town that we call Congregational, but it has got nothing to do with the United Church of Christ. I mean, there's a group here in North Dakota, they call it the Prairie Congregational, something, and then there's a national organization, if I heard the 4Cs, Conservative Congregational Christian Churches of America. I mean, they're a breakaway from that United Church of Christ. And across the prairies, that happened a lot. I mean, right around here, you'd have to go to Jamestown to find a congregational church that's part of the United Church of Christ.
Want to take a look at it first?
Oh, well, you know, this Alma Herman, I don't know if you look around, I'm sure you'd find some of her work. After she retired, she lived in Chicago and she come back to Fargo to take care of her sister. And then she worked at the university helping him as a translator. I don't remember who she, no, this is just a family picture.
So this would be related to your mother?
Yes, my mother's family.
Okay.
But there isn't anybody alive anymore.
Where's your mother in the picture?
Oh, yeah, here, the first one here.
First one there?
And the next one was Martha, if you want to.
Yeah, just let me
Yeah.
know.
And then the next one there is Grandpa Herman, and next to him is Grandma Herman. And then is Alma, this gal.
Okay.
And then in the end, Matilda, she was the oldest in the family. And starting over here, there's Fred, Richard, Molly, and Johanna, and Rose, Willie, and Harry. There's one brother that isn't on here, and Jacob. I mean, he lived in Bismarck, and whenever they took this picture, evidently he wasn't around. But this whole family had pretty well scattered. The only one that stayed around here was Richard. His grandson, great-grandson, lives on the Herman farm. But all the others, a bunch of them headed to Minneapolis and then eventually to Chicago. There was 3 of the sisters that spent their life living in Chicago, one of them in Minneapolis. And so none of them were around except my mother and the oldest, Matilda. She's got a son that lives in Jamestown.
So when your mother came over, she was 6. How many of the other children were
Well,
alive?
Molly and Johanna and Matilda and Mary, my mother. So there was 4 of them actually already.
Okay. And the rest of them then were born in
Born
America?
in this country. Yeah.
Okay. Did you get to know your aunts and uncles when you were growing up?
Yes, all of them. I mean, you know, some of them moved away, but they always came back. There usually was a reunion either every summer or every other summer. So I got to know all of them quite well, you know.
Who were you closest to?
Well, the ones I had the most contact with was probably Molly, because she lived in Minneapolis, and I had a sister living down there, so, you know, we'd get together every once in a while, so I got to know her better. And of course, you know, Alma was one of the younger ones, and she was a school teacher, not in my school, but when my sisters went to school, she was a teacher in the Maricourt School District someplace. So I got to know her quite well. And then when she came back to Fargo, I went over there. I spent some time in the hospital, and I had time off, and I went to visit her in the apartment in Fargo where she was living. And I can remember that one time my wife was in the hospital, had a hip replaced, and Alma was still living, and I picked her up at her apartment. We went down to the hospital to visit her. And she said, imagine my next birthday, I'm going to be 80. Well, she thought that was just something. I know, I'm 80. I didn't think it was a big deal.
So when you were growing up, what type of aunts were Molly and Elma? Were they what was their personality like?
Well, I mean, you know, I suppose you'd call them a little sophisticated because were living in the cities, but I mean, they were always good conversationalists when the bunch got together. This, yeah, I point this. That's not him. This was Martha, and she ended up with being blind. I mean, she had glaucoma as a child, and they didn't really know how to treat it. And she lived. She had sight, but she read Braille and that kind of stuff. And I got to know her quite well because she got married to some gentleman, and they lived in Fargo, and they had a clinic, a massage clinic or something that they both worked with people. That was sort of before chiropractors became popular.
So how old was she when she started having to learn how to read Braille and?
Oh, I imagine, around 10 or something, because they sent her up to Bathgate. Bathgate, North Dakota was the school for the blind, and that's where she learned the Braille and those things. But she never totally, I mean, even in later, she never totally lost her sight. I mean, she could see light, in front. But this gentleman that she had got married to, he was totally blind. And he had a woodworking shop in his basement. And he worked with tools, never cut a finger off. But he wasn't a German from Russia. He was a strict Norwegian.
Oh, but that caused some family drama for a while.
Of course, any of these that got married, no, the only guy that got married to a German gal was that guy that isn't on here, Jake. The men, they all got married to non-German gals.
Really?
And I suppose at the beginning the grandparents weren't all that happy about it when they got married to non-German.
Okay, who's this handsome-looking guy?
Well, that's me in the Army in the Second World War.
About how old were you when you were drafted?
About 18 and 6 months.
And how long did you end up serving for?
2 years. Now, is that going to enlarge that a little bit?
Yep, we're gonna take care of that.
Yeah.
That's why I
Because
set that up.
that's pretty small
Yep.
there.
Yep, we'll take care of that. We've got our stuff. We'll take a digital copy of it and then we'll increase it for the
Okay.
camera. Okay, now who is here?
That's my grandpa, Frederick Herman, and of course my grandma, Johanna Herman.
And these
Now,
are
her maiden name was Belter. And none of her family, except those in Oklahoma, but none of her family ever settled in the Culm area.
These are your mom's parents,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Did you get to know them when you were a kid?
Yes, quite well.
How far did they live from your farm?
Oh, about 2.5 miles. So the way the crow flies, yeah. Along the Sioux line, they just lived a ways up from, I said we lived along the Sioux line, halfway to Maricourt.
So would you go visit them often?
Yeah, we usually, and he learned to drive a car when they had a Model T Ford, with the foot pedals. Then later on, they bought a Model A Ford with a straight stick, you'd call it now. He never managed to drive that. So we'd pick him up and take him to church on Sundays usually. So we got to know him quite well.
So when you think
He wasn't a true farmer. He had a good business in Russia. He was a carpenter, and he made cabinets and coffins and all that kind of stuff. and it really wasn't his idea to leave that behind. But Grandma insisted. When these Hermans left, there was my great-grandfather. He had 4 sons, and they were all close to that eligibility for being drafted. Not my grandpa, because he was older than that. So when the old guy decided to leave, they had a conference one night, and he said, "We have decided to go to America, and whoever wants to stay back, that's up to you." So the 4 of them come as the great-grandfather and 4 of his sons.
So did you know your great-grandfather, or?
No, he died before my time. I heard a lot about him because he lived on the same farm with his youngest son, and those guys used to tell stories. He had his own house, and then he became a widower. His wife had died. He always had a garden, and in Russia, they raised a lot of fruit like apples and that kind of stuff. So he knew how, and he had a garden, and he lived a ways away. And of course, the young guys from his youngest son, they're the Gottlieb Herman boys, and they told stories about that he was going to watch these guys that they didn't get into his garden. So where he had his pat, he'd sweep that all clean so they could see the tracks when they go. And incidentally, the youngest brother to my grandfather has got a son here living in town yet. He's 98. He'll be 99 here in August. But he's the only one of that whole generation. He doesn't have any cousins. He's the only one that has survived that long. I mean, there's a number of family, next generation, but in his, this guy was a cousin to my mother, and there was nobody left in that family besides him. And he's still living on his own. They just put their house up for sale. There were some new apartments put up in town for not assisted living, but you don't have no lawn to cut, and you don't have no so they just are moving into that house now. Up to now, his first wife had died, and he got married to a very nice young gal, younger than he was. I mean, she's not young anymore, but she was about 10 years younger than he was, and they've been married for 18 years now. Yeah. There's another a gal in town that's I think she's 97, and she was living in her own house until this summer. Now she moved to or they call it the village. I mean, it's a housing project that they got an apartment in, and everything is furnished for them. So it's not assisted living, but pretty close to that. But other than that, I mean, there aren't very many that get in their 90s. We had one gentleman that was 100 about a year ago, I think, and he was living in those apartments for a few years. And he was 100 in December, and then he died the next spring or something. But he was still living alone until he had never been married. He was a bachelor. That's why he said he lived so long. Yeah.
When you think back to your grandfather, what type of a person was he?
Well, he was a little better educated than most people were. I don't know why. I mean, maybe he put more effort into it because he'd be a Sunday school teacher, and in those days, they eventually became part of the Culm congregation, and then they had what you call a circuit preacher. There were 4 little churches scattered around, and he'd be preaching in a Culm church one Sunday, and the next Sunday he'd be in one of these satellite churches. And in between, well, then Grandpa usually led the service.
Really? How about your grandmother?
In German, of course.
Yeah.
But he learned to speak a bit of English.
Did he?
Yeah, I mean, because he ended up with daughter-in-laws and things like that couldn't speak anything but English, so he sort of necessity.
How about your grandmother? What type of a person was she?
Well, she was so completely opposite from Grandpa. I mean, she was quiet, and I don't think she ever read a book or cared about reading one. I mean, she was a nice gal, but she was so completely different. But yeah, she raised a big family, and I would say out of those 12, there was never a doctor's midwife, but never a doctor assisted for birth. And they all survived through. There wasn't the one that even died in infancy. This, that's the picture, that Johanna, I said she lived out in Montana, and she died in, oh, maybe when she was 40 or something. And the others all got to quite an old age. Like I said, that one, Matilda, the oldest one, she got to be 100, and she ended up in a nursing home, but only for a short time. She had lived on her own in town here, and then Rose, well, she lived in Chicago, and her husband had died a long time ago, and she got to be right a good stretch in the 90s. And the gal that lived in Minneapolis, she got to be 90. The men, none of them really got that old. I don't think any of the men ever, well, Uncle Jake probably got to be 70, but the others were all earlier than that.
Okay, what's this picture here?
Well, that's my family, and this cousin from Germany come to visit us here back, I suppose it's got to be around 10 years ago already. And that is his wife there, this gentleman's. And that's my younger brother. He's not alive anymore.
What was his name?
Edgar. And this is my wife, Dorothy. Her maiden name was Gackle. And this is Edgar's wife, also named Dorothy. So we had two Dorothy Mills. And this is myself, and this is Ewald's wife from Germany. And either one of them, they could about say hello or something like that in English, and that was about as far as it went. I realized how poor my German was when I had to keep a conversation going with them. You know, we got a habit of, if we don't know the word in German, we just throw an English one in. Well, that didn't go with those guys, but they were an enjoyable company. And they had just, they thought we would have to come and visit. Every time they wrote and said, when are you coming? And I had fully intended to, and I never got it. We were in Germany. I took a tour in Germany once in the 80s, you know, an organized tour across. But at that time, we had not been in contact with these people. So we never looked them up. My brother did go and visit them over in Germany. He was in the Air Force Reserve, and he got all over the world. And one time they had gone to Germany, and he had been able to take time off and go and visit them. They had a nice home over there, and they had come back to Germany with the clothes on their back. That's all. When the Russians let them go out of there, they left Russia. Now I said, well, if I want to come and visit, I'd certainly want to take some time off and go to, you know, where that Bessarabia in South Russia was at. Well, he said, not me. Some Bolsheviks kicked us out of there. He says, I have no intentions of ever going back. They weren't very happy with the situation. When we were over there in Germany, then the Iron Curtain was still up. I mean, some guys got a permit to go, but it took quite a bit of doing to get the permit to go to East Germany or Russia, you know. But I don't know. Now, I don't suppose I'll ever go very far anymore. I'm not in at greatest health, and my wife is in not good shape at all. I mean, she's losing her eyesight through macular degeneration. So that's my dad's brother.
What was his name?
Let's see, what was Friedrich, yeah.
And he stayed back in Russia?
He stayed back in Russia, yeah. And when, you know, this Ewald that come to visit us, well, I asked him, well, how was his youth growing up? And he said, man, he had a good youth. You know, it was after the First World War, and this Bessarabia actually become part of Romania. And he said the government didn't interfere with them at all. They went to German school and all that, where when these Hermans took off, they were putting pressure on for these children to go to a Russian school. Where he said after the First World War and it became part of Romania, he said he had a good childhood. They never they never had hardships. You know, they didn't have the 30-30s like we did here. And they never. He said they never had a tractor to farm with. They had a farm with horses or what, oxen, whatever was available. He said there were tractors in the area, but he said his family, they never had a tractor. Now I don't really know whether his father stayed a farmer over there or whether he, got into some other I just don't remember.
So did your father stay in contact with his family in Russia?
Yes, they did until the Second World War, and then everything started. They had stayed in contact. Same way with that sister, and there was a bigger family because my dad's mother, he never got to know her. She died before he was old enough to know her. So his father had got remarried. So there were some stepchildren there, but I mean, this one and the other one were the only ones that were full brother and sister to my dad. Well, that's our family picture. I don't know. I don't imagine I was more than maybe 6, 7 years old at the time.
Let's see. Let's
Hey,
start with the two standing up.
on this picture, my dad even got some hair yet. I mean, I never knew him with any hair. He was always bald.
Who is this right here?
My sister Ann,
And did she get married?
yeah, she got married to Roy Anderson.
Anderson?
Yeah, she went to Minnesota, and the Swedes were all over there, and she got married.
And who is this?
Ruth, and she got married to Emil Chanke.
Okay, and then
No, this one over there, that's my mother.
let's go.
Oh,
this way,
start
okay?
over
Yeah.
there. My father, Christian Nill, yeah.
Christian Nill. And then
And my kid brother, Edgar, and
then the girl in the middle.
that's my sister Ione, and she is the only one besides me that's left of the family.
What's her name?
Ione,
How do you spell
I-O-N-E.
I-O-N-E. I've never heard of that
Never
name.
heard that name?
No. Did she get married?
Yeah, she got married to Gilbert Schaefer. She also had met him. He had come up here to work on a thrashing rig. He came from Tripp, South Dakota. And that's when they were married. They lived in Tripp all their married life. And her husband just died a year ago in August here. And she's in a nursing home, but she's still hanging in there.
And then this
And
little boy is you?
That's me, yeah. And look at the hair. I thought they should last 2 lifetimes.
So who would cut your hair when you were growing up?
My mother.
Did she cut your hair?
And then sometimes after we got a little older, my uncle, John, married to mother's older sister, he sort of become a barber, and he had a clipper. My mother had to cut him with the scissors.
Was that a long process for you to sit still?
Oh, yes, I usually ended up a crying session before it was over.
So would you get photographs taken often when you were growing up?
Well, as long as I can remember, my mother had a box camera. So, not every family did, but my mother, so there was quite a few. Of course, this was a picture by a photographer. Used to be a photographer here in town, and I imagine that's where this one was taken. No, it just lists the names on there. It doesn't. But that had been in a paper frame at one time, glued in, I suppose. I don't even remember whether we had kept. I had asked my niece to send some pictures. I thought she had. Now I don't remember whether she had these or whether we had hung on to. And this is my dad's sister and her husband. And they only had that one son. I remember when the folks used to correspond with them quite regular. But after the Second World War started, who knows? I doubt very much whether they survived probably the Second World War. There's a lot of people in Bessarabia that didn't survive. You know.
What is her name?
What is it? Doesn't say on there, what? Can't think of it offhand. I don't know.
But she did have contact with your dad until the
Yes,
war.
until the second. And I don't even remember. I think she was older than he was a year or so.
Was that hard for your dad to leave his family behind?
Not really. I mean, I don't think that he was really very close to his father, and his mother had died. He never had got to know her. So he never complained, but I suppose he had a content with stepmothers, and sometimes those things didn't go real good. I don't know. I mean, he never said much.
Did he ever say how his mother died?
If he did, I forget. I don't think it was a childbirth, but she died shortly after he. This other gentleman was born after my dad was, so she was around a while, but he just never really got to know her because kid 3-4 years old. You
No memories of it. Okay.
Well, that's about the last family picture was taken when the folks were still both living.
Let me see something real quick.
Does it say anything on that?
Chris, Mary, Nill, Ruth, Anne, Ione, Ray, and Edgar.
Yeah, that's my brother. He was 2 years younger than I
So
am.
it goes Edgar, and then
Then Ione,
Ione,
Anne,
then you.
and Ruth,
Okay.
and mother and dad.
About how old do you think you were here?
Well, it was before I was married, so I imagine it was about in 1950 or something like that when that picture was taken.
Okay. Is this on the old farm or?
No, it's at they used to live here on the east side of town, and it was there where this picture was taken.
Okay.
I can recognize the house too.
So when you were growing up, who were you closest to out of your brothers and your brother and sisters?
Well, Ruth, because she stayed around here. The others were, and I stayed after I got out of the service. I stayed one winter with them while I was working around town. So by far she was the closest, and now she was the last one left. I mean, we had a grandson got married in Fargo last year on the 1st of July, so we went over a day earlier, and then we visited with her. But she was in a nursing home in Barnesville, Minnesota, because that's where her daughter was living. And she died very shortly after. By August sometime she died. So that was she was, she knew what was going on. She was in a wheelchair because she had problems walking, but that's the last time I saw her before she died.
What was her personality?
A lot like her grandmother's, it's kind of quiet and you couldn't hardly get into an argument with her or something like.
How about Ione? What was her personality?
Well, a whole lot different. I grew up with her because she was only 2 years older than I was, and I mean, we got along, but I don't know, she had a personality of her own, and I think it's to her detriment now. She's in a nursing home, but she's more mentally got problems than physical ones, and I don't know. I mean, the last time I saw was at her husband's funeral last August, and Well, she calls every once in a while, and you talk to her, and you think, well, she hasn't got a problem in the world. And you start to hang up, and she says, well, I'll just go back and sit here. And they've got recreation there in the home, but I don't know. And, I suppose the sad part of it is the shape she's in. She could live on for years like that. She hasn't got no physical problems. She's on a ton of pills, but they get you in a nursing home, they don't want to let you die. You're too good property for income.
How about Edgar? What was he like as a young boy?
Wild. Wild, yeah. When I was, when I left for the service and he was the only one home, well, I don't know. He was chasing girls before he was 15 years old, and he got married real young. And he had 4 kids with the first marriage. Well, then that come apart, and he got married to another gal that had been married before and had a son from a previous marriage, and he had two children with her, and that ended up in divorce. And then he got married to that Dorothy here, because they had outgrown being parents by then. He had spent all of his life in the active reserve in Minneapolis. And then along with that job in the reserves, he was a maintenance mechanic in the Air Force. So his job, when he wasn't going someplace with the reserve unit, he was working on the planes in Minneapolis at the St. It wasn't the same place where the airport is at. They had their own, the reserve had their own airport there. It was an active reserve. So he traveled all over the world. Wherever there was a trouble spot, they'd ship some planes over there and drop some troops over there. They were using planes at that time. The earlier jet planes could not slow down enough to drop paratroopers. They had to keep those old propeller-driven planes still. But now I guess they do. I mean, they drop them out of jet planes. But so he spent a lot of time all over the world, and he had drinking problems, and he smoked until he couldn't hardly see anymore, and he finally did quit smoking, but it was kind of late, and he ended up with emphysema, and he had been retired. They had spent a couple of years going to Texas for the winter, but I think it's 3 or 4 years ago when he died.
How about Anne? What type of a sister was she?
Anne?
Yeah.
Well, she left home quite early. She worked in Bismarck, I remember one time, and then she come back home for a while, and then she went to Minneapolis, and she eventually got married down there. I used to go and visit her. We used to get to Minneapolis quite often. They never had any children, so, and her husband had died many years ago already. She had been a widow for 25 years, I think, by the time she died. One thing she had kept back, she was still conservative until the last day. And in spite of, she was always saving, but when she died, like I said, she had no kids, so she left whatever she had, she left to the nephews and nieces. And we had 5 kids, and they each got around $2,000 from her estate. And there were others. Ione had 2 girls, and Ruth had 1. But I say she kept that from the German heritage, kind of being conservative.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, the house, as I remember. Now, in order to get this in 3D, well, let's just say I'm looking at the south side of it here, and there was a window up here, down here, and there was an entryway on Here, let's see, let's put that. It wasn't a flat roof, it was a peaked roof like the house. And the barn, I'll never get an offer to go to art school. Let's see. There was down there. It had a door in it, window. And there were some windows up there. This was what you'd call a really a modern barn because it had a hayloft on top of it. We put that hay up there to feed the cattle, where a lot of people only had a barn that didn't have any hay loft on top of it, so they had to carry the hay in from the outside. So we thought, and let's see, there were a sort. Now, you wouldn't, I added a lot. I built onto this house. You just want what it looked like. Yeah.
When you were growing up.
Yeah. Well, we had a grain, and then over here, and that's where you put the grain in, and you shoveled it in on top there. And then over here by the barn, there was that's about it. What the buildings were there when my.
So what's this off of this one?
That's the entry into the house.
Okay. And then this is.
This is a grain bin.
Okay. Where was the outhouse?
Oh, right behind the house. I forgot that. I shouldn't have forgot.
That's important to living.
Yeah, they make a big deal about it nowadays. They all had a half-moon door cut in there.
What'd you use for toilet paper back then?
Would you believe a Sears Roebuck catalog?
Really?
And the pages that were, the index, and they were soft paper, they weren't too bad, but that glossy stuff.
So this is pretty much what was on the farm.
Yeah, and it like I say, they had just started it, and
where were the fields at? Were they north or south of the farm?
well, they were southeast of the farm. The pasture was straight south of the farm, and then the cultivated fields were over here in this area.
Okay. Was there a road that led into your farm? Like, where would that have been?
Well, there is now, but back then it was just a trail.
Okay. So did you guys have a car when you were growing up?
Yes, my folks had bought a 1926 Chevy, and I was born in 26, so I never, but it was what they called a touring car. It had side curtains on it. Yeah. And in the wintertime, they flapped.
Where would you keep all of the farm equipment? You talked about having a binder and...
In the fence row in the wintertime.